So I'll be talking today about the work that we've been doing in the Pumicestone Passage over the past 5 to 6 years to do with the fish communities of Pumicestone Passage. And it's fair to say that the research that we've been doing over that time has significantly advanced our understanding of the fish communities of the passage. And we can now use that information to assist management even further. So we know that the Pumicestone Passage has really high habitat diversity, particularly in the marine parts of the area. And what I'll do is just use this map here to demonstrate that point. So here I have a map of the mangrove distribution in the passage. And when you start laying over on top of that the additional habitats that we have, for example, here we have salt marsh, swamp oak forest, which we're starting to work at USC here, critically or threatened regional ecosystem, and then a huge number of pasture and wetlands right around the passage. You begin to build up a picture about the diversity of habitats that are actually present in the passage. And we know, as pretty well a rule, that high habitat diversity usually indicates high fish diversity. There's a couple of additional things that you need to consider when trying to interrogate these patterns in the passage, and that is the presence of no-take marine reserves, which you can see in the grey there, here and offshore, and a small one on the north side of, on the eastern side of Bribie Island. And then, of course, we have the shellfish restoration project, which is going to be one of the key focus of my presentation today. So today I'll talk about impacts and habitats of the passage and how they influence the fish assemblages, the influence of marine reserves on fish assemblages in the passage, the impact of restoration. But on top of that, there's been a diversity of work done, not only here at USC, but beyond, on all of these topics. Topics like fish functional diversity, ecological functions, critical ecological functions that drive the condition of ecosystems that are undertaken by fish, the effects of habitat condition, surf zone fishes on the Bribie Ocean Beach, which has been a focus of our work, and pollutants, especially PFAS metals and pesticides in fisheries assets. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to cover those today, but if you're interested in that, I'd be happy to chat further. So as I mentioned, the degree to which the Pumicestone Passage has been surveyed in terms of the fish assemblages has significantly ramped up in the past decade. So prior to 2010, there was sporadic information, fairly little was published. But we can now safely say that Pumicestone Passage is now arguably the best understood estuary in Queensland in terms of the impact of reserves, restoration and impacts for fish, possibly rivaled only by the Noosa River. So it's a great news story, a lot of research undertaken by the organisations that you can see here. If it's not the best understood, it's certainly the best surveyed. And this is how we do it. We have undertaken over the past couple of years a lot of underwater videography, and it results in these tremendous videos that we can bring here. Here's a reticulate whipray. This is some of the seagrass. You can see, I think, a little bit of lyngbia sitting on top of that seagrass there. And so we use this sort of information to not only survey the fish, but also to have some great promotional information. So if you're interested in these sorts of videos, we have a lot of videos up on our YouTube channel. If you go to YouTube and search USC Fish Ecology Research, you'll be able to see all of our videos, including the videos of the work that we've done in the surf zones of Bribie Island. So during the shellfish reef restoration surveys, we identified significant fish diversity in the Pumicestone Passage. This is southern Pumicestone Passage around the restoration project. There are 83 species of fish, of which 31 are harvested, and we identified 6 IUCN vulnerable or above, so vulnerable, endangered or critically endangered species in that location. During the Sunshine Coast Council monitoring program that we've been undertaking with Sunshine Coast Council in the last 2 years, this is in northern Pumicestone around Caloundra, we identified 48 species, 17 of those were harvestable, and 4 IUCN vulnerable and above. So there's a bit of a disparity there between northern and southern Pumicestone, but that is pretty much only due to a lower survey effort in the northern part of Pumicestone. It's likely that the same species pools are occurring in both locations. So it's nearly 100 estuarine species occurring just in Pumicestone Passage. And these are some of the key species that we identified. I mentioned some of the vulnerable and above species. We've identified Queensland groper, white-spotted guitarfish. The guitarfish were recently upgraded, the whole family, to critically endangered, and there's 2 or 3 species occurring just in the Pumicestone Passage. So to say that it's an important habitat is really an understatement. Throughout all this research that we've done, we've been able to identify really 4 key impacts. Urbanisation is a key impact on fish assemblages in the bay. Poor water quality is obviously an impact on the bay, on the passage rather. Habitat degradation has reduced the extent of key habitats in the passage, which has resulted in declines in fish. And finally, fishing as well has also impacted the diversity and abundance of fish. And we here at USC have worked to develop restoration models to try and overcome some of those impacts. So if we look broadly now across all of southeast Queensland to try and work out what the drivers of estuarine fish assemblages are, we can really break it down into 2 scales. At the regional or estuary scale, we now know, due to collaborative work that we've done with Healthy Land and Water, here we have on this axis importance of the variable, and on these axes are the variables themselves. The most important driver at a regional scale of fish assemblages is actually the urbanisation of the estuary edge, followed by the width of the estuary. Of course, Pumicestone Passage is a very wide estuary. The extent of mangroves, and then chlorophyll A. So at a regional scale, those are the key impacts. When you look down at individual habitats, it's really to do with where that habitat is positioned relative to other habitats. So if we're surveying an individual seagrass bed or an individual mangrove forest, it matters most how much seagrass there is around there, how much mangrove there is around there. So you can see here that we have a regional and then narrow-scaled idea of the distribution of fish in Pumicestone Passage, and then we can then use that to try and optimise our management. So we need to restore and manage our systems, particularly in Pumicestone Passage, but we need to make sure that we do that in the right place, and this will become a theme of my talk. What about marine reserves? I hear you say there are marine reserves in the estuary, in Pumicestone Passage. How are they faring for fish? Pumicestone Passage and the estuary marine reserves in Pumicestone Passage were part of a broader study that we undertook with Healthy Land and Water in 2016, and the findings were directly relatable to what we found in Pumicestone Passage. These were the sorts of fish assemblages that we typically saw in marine reserves. Not much. You can compare that to the video that I showed you previously, and you can see here that the diversity and the abundance of fish in the marine reserves, this is actually from Tripconney, is much lower than what our control sites were, which is a big concern. And when we actually went through and analysed that, we realised that there was a couple of things going on here. Throughout the Moreton Bay Marine Park, the reserves in estuaries, I'm not talking about the open reserves in the open bay, the reserves that protect estuaries like the ones in Pumicestone Passage are really only effective for species that are not targeted by fishers. For example, yellowfin bream and sea mullet are not in higher abundance in those locations. And it's because the reserves that we have chosen in Moreton Bay are in suboptimal positions for fish. They can serve either very poorly flushed estuaries or estuaries like Tripconney, which are large and shallow. And unfortunately, it's a simple fact of biology that those fish need water. So these are not necessarily great habitats for fish, but the reserves are in the wrong place for fish, although I acknowledge that there are other reasons why we would implement reserves. If we want to implement reserves to enhance the abundance of fish in these locations, we need to perhaps think more closely about it. So moving now from impacts through to marine reserves and now to the Pumicestone Passage Shellfish Reef Restoration Project. You can see here the map of the restoration project. Here in the blue areas, here is where we were surveying the reefs. And all of these black dots that you can see around here, Susie mentioned before, are what we call our fish map sites. So this is a 200-metre grid of underwater cameras that we placed before the installation of the reefs and then every 6 months after, for a total of 3 years of data. Hence why I mentioned that Pumicestone is really one of the best understood estuaries now in terms of the distribution and abundance of fish. It's mostly due to this restoration project. So at the end of the project, at the end of the restoration project, at the end of the survey period that we undertook in June last year, there were 3.8 times the richness of fish on the reef site than at nearby control sites. The total abundance of fish at the site was 10.7 times higher on the reef than nearby. And perhaps the most exciting result that we found was that harvestable fish abundance was 16.4 times higher on the reef than at our control sites. So it's fair to say that there's a significant increase of fish abundance and diversity at the reef site relative to the control sites. And you can see here, those patterns were consistent throughout. So this is on the y-axis here, you can see species richness, total fish abundance and harvestable fish abundance, and this is over time. Basically, the pattern that you can see here is that over time, these increase. The grey bars, which are the reefs themselves, increase significantly over time. And so the differences between the reefs and the controls were consistent through time. We're very confident that the patterns that we found there are a true pattern. But the question that we're always asked is, are the fish just centralising there? Are we simply installing a fish attracting device? Are we taking fish from the broader seascape, attracting them into the oyster reef? Are we actually increasing the overall productivity of the system? And so to do that, we used these fish maps. Now, there's a lot of information going on here. Don't worry too much about the detail. I'll walk you through it. Every time we went out, we surveyed those about 100 sites throughout the Pumicestone Passage, surveyed that every 6 months. And we were able to identify whether there were any changes in the distribution of fish, not only at the reef site, but across the entire seascape itself. So we were able to identify whether fish were just simply attracting their way towards that shellfish reef restoration project. These are the sorts of maps that we can make up of this. If you're interested in this, I'm happy to send around the final report to you. But these are heat maps. You get an idea about the distribution of those fish assemblages over time. When we take it the next step statistically and start modelling that all out, once again, there's a lot of information here. Don't expect you to take it all in. But what we actually found was that there was a significant effect. There was a significant effect of the site of where you were positioned relative to the reef, but that didn't change over time. There was really no immediate attraction effect of the reef. So once we installed the reef, there wasn't a significant attraction effect of the reef towards of the fish towards the reef. And there was no effect of before or after the reef restoration, and there was no reductions in abundance of fish throughout the broader seascape over time. So what we had really was a significant increase in the abundance and diversity of fish at the oyster reef site, and no change elsewhere in the distribution or abundance of fish in the seascape. So what we can now say is that the installation of that oyster reef has significantly increased the overall carrying capacity of that entire system. It's a really great story, and it goes to show that not only does oyster restoration restore a habitat, but it enhances the habitat for fish across an entire seascape. We have enhanced the capacity for the Pumicestone Passage to hold fish, for fish and fishes, the fish that we like to catch and eat, by restoring that oyster restoration project. And we really learned, because of all those different types of habitats that Susie mentioned in her speech, that shellfish reefs with very high habitat diversity tend to equal more fish. So a couple of really key take-home messages that I'd like for you guys to take home today. The extent, position and condition of estuarine habitats really matters. We need to continue our habitat protection efforts and we need to restore them. We now know that restoration is a significant benefit to not only fish, but to habitat in the Pumicestone Passage. It's going to be important for us to continue those efforts. But we need to undertake those efforts in the correct spots. We can't just be doing that willy-nilly. We need to have an overarching plan. Where are we going to install these marine reserves? Where are we going to place the future restoration effort? Seascape context and accessibility to those habits for fish, for those habitats for fish matters. And so we should continue to advocate for the correct implementation of those management interventions. Thank you. I'm going to ask myself some questions. Which is my favourite? Can we put oyster reefs in marine parks to better protect these areas? Yes, it is one of the options that we can implement restoration in some of the marine parks. By doing that, then there's evidence for this worldwide that you can get synergistic benefits of restoring in marine reserves. So it is one option. Susie mentioned before that we're working with parks at the moment to come up with some strategies for that. It's probably a couple of years away. Do I have time for another one? One quick one, all right. How can marine reserves be realigned to better correspond with research? I think we have a long history now of researching in Moreton Bay how the position of marine reserves and the condition of the habitat in the marine reserves actually influences their effectiveness for fish. I think that information's there now. We just really need to implement it. So it becomes an advocating process now to be able to put those reserves in the places they need to be if we want to enhance the abundance of fish. There are a variety of reasons why we implement marine reserves to do with habitat, intertidal areas for wader birds, but for fish specifically, we now have a good idea about that as it comes time to advocating for the correct decisions to be made.